The Topkapi Palace, Constantinople, the year 1595. A heavy silence suffocates the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a quiet that is not peaceful, but predatory. A new Sultan, Mehmed III, has claimed the throne, his ascension not marked by celebration but consecrated by a chilling command, one that will unleash the palace's silent executioners upon the innocent. What follows is a night of methodical, horrific slaughter, a quiet purge to secure a dynasty. 19 of the Sultan's own brothers, some no older than infants, are systematically erased from the world by the cold efficiency of the silken cord. This was not the act of a madman. It was the grim fulfillment of a terrible law, the ultimate price of absolute power. To truly grasp the cold logic that birthed such a monstrous policy, we must journey further back into the turbulent crucible of the early Ottoman centuries, a time when the death of a sultan was not a moment for orderly succession, but a starting gun for a frantic and bloody race to power. Imagine the scene. A great ruler dies in the capital, and as his body grows cold, riders are dispatched across the vast Anatolian plains and the rugged Balkan mountains, carrying the fateful news to his sons, each governing a distant province. For these princes, the message does not herald a period of mourning for their father, but signals the immediate start of a war against their brothers. Fraternal affection, if any ever existed, would evaporate in an instant, replaced by the primal calculus of survival. Each son knew that only one could sit on the throne, and the rest were destined for either exile or, more likely, a shallow grave. The first to reach the capital, to secure the imperial treasury and win the allegiance of the formidable Janissary Corps, held the ultimate advantage. This mad dash was merely the prelude to the true horror. The princes who were slower or farther away would not simply concede. They would raise their own armies, conscripting the local populace and turning their provinces into personal war machines. The result was catastrophic civil war, a recurring nightmare that tore the empire apart from within. The very lands that the Ottomans had fought so hard to conquer became battlefields where Ottoman fought Ottoman, Turk fought Turk. The fertile fields of Anatolia, the empire's breadbasket, were trampled by marching armies and scorched by retreating ones. Trade routes that carried silks and spices were severed, economies were shattered, and a generation of young men was sacrificed not to expand the empire's borders, but to settle a family squabble with steel and fire. This internal bleeding left the state perilously vulnerable, its frontiers exposed to opportunistic enemies, from the Safavid Shahs in Persia to the Hungarian kings and Venetian fleets in the west. The decade-long interregnum following the capture of Sultan Bayezid I was the ultimate cautionary tale, a period of pure anarchy where his sons waged a relentless war against each other, nearly dissolving the empire before it could truly begin. This was the terror that the law of fratricide sought to prevent, a deep-seated institutional memory of chaos so profound that the systematic murder of children would later seem like a reasonable, even necessary, price to pay for order. Out of this recurring storm of fratricidal chaos and existential dread rose a figure of unparalleled vision and ruthlessness, a sultan who would not only conquer Constantinople, but would also seek to conquer the very political instability that threatened his empire from within. This was Sultan Mehmed II, known to history as Fatih, the conqueror, a man who understood that to build an empire that could last 1,000 years, its foundations needed to be secured with something colder and harder than stone. He saw the endemic civil wars not as a tragic inevitability, but as a systemic flaw that could be engineered out of the state machinery, albeit through a terrifyingly direct and brutal mechanism. He would not leave this crucial matter to chance, tradition, or the individual conscience of his descendants. Instead, he enshrined the practice of fratricide into the very legal bedrock of the empire. Within his great code of laws, the Kanun name, he inscribed the fateful and chilling ordinance that would echo through the centuries, a clause that gave the sanction of law to what was once a desperate act of survival. The decree was brutally clear in its purpose, stating that for the sake of the public good, for the preservation of the Nizam-ul-Alam, whichever of his sons ascended to the throne was not only permitted but was lawfully required to put his brothers to death. This was not a suggestion. It was a state imperative. It was a calculated political decision, framed as a terrible necessity. A firebreak burned into the imperial family tree to prevent the wildfire of civil war from consuming the entire forest. The law transformed the act from a crime of passion into a dispassionate duty of office, a grim responsibility that came with the imperial throne. It was the ultimate sacrifice of the personal for the political, a declaration that the bonds of blood were secondary to the integrity of the state. Mehmed the Conqueror's chilling decree sought to impose a horrific certainty upon the chaos of succession, ensuring that the transfer of power would be swift, absolute, and final, even if it meant the first act of every new sultan was to become the executioner of his own family, a somber and morbid solution to a relentless problem. This brutal, abstract law, codified by a long-dead ancestor, was not some dusty legal relic for the man who would become Sultan Mehmed III. It was a fresh and bleeding wound at the very heart of his own family, a lesson taught to him in the most intimate and terrifying way possible. For he had witnessed its application firsthand, a visceral and formative experience that occurred upon the ascension of his own father, Sultan Murad III, in the year 1574. When the time came for Murad to claim the throne, there was no hesitation, no moment of familial doubt, only the cold and immediate application of the conqueror's law. Upon arriving in the capital, one of his first official acts was to issue the death warrant for his 5 half-brothers, young princes who, just moments before, had been his kin, and were now reduced to mere political obstacles, loose threads to be snipped from the imperial tapestry. One can only imagine the atmosphere within the Topkapi Palace on that night. The whispered orders, the silent tread of the executioner's feet on marble floors, the muffled sounds from the prince's chambers as the silk cords did their work, extinguishing 5 potential futures to secure one. This was the environment in which the young Mehmed grew up. He would have known these uncles, perhaps played with them in the palace gardens, only to see them vanish overnight, their names suddenly forbidden, their existence erased to sanctify his father's reign. The experience would have been a profound and chilling education in the true nature of Ottoman power, demonstrating that the throne he was destined to inherit was not just a seat of authority but a solitary peak, and to stand upon it required casting everyone else off the mountain. This event served as the ultimate precedent, a direct and bloody blueprint for his own future actions. The execution of 5 brothers established the grim tradition for his generation, setting a standard that he would not only meet but exceed with shocking totality, proving the relentless, escalating logic of the law. It was the final, brutal lesson that solidified his worldview. Power was indivisible, mercy was a liability, and the bonds of blood were the first sacrifice demanded at the altar of the state. With this brutal lesson seared into his very soul, the young Prince Mehmed was sent away from the suffocating intrigues of the capital to the traditional training ground for an heir apparent, the provincial governorship of Manisa. Here, nestled in the fertile lands of western Anatolia, he was meant to learn the intricate arts of statecraft, to command troops, to dispense justice, and to manage the complexities of a provincial economy, all while existing as the sultanate in waiting. It was a life of immense privilege and power, yet it was also a gilded cage, a period of protracted waiting under the permanent, chilling shadow of his father's throne and the ever-present law of succession. His every action was watched, his every decision reported back to the capital, his very existence a constant reminder to his father of his own mortality. But Mehmed was not alone in this gilded exile. He was under the constant, overwhelming influence of his mother, the formidable and ferociously ambitious Safiye Sultan. A woman of legendary intelligence and political acumen, Safiye understood the treacherous currents of the Ottoman court better than anyone. She was the chief architect of her son's future, meticulously grooming him not just for rule, but for the savage act of survival that would precede it. Their bond was one forged in the crucible of ambition and paranoia, a symbiotic relationship where her relentless drive for power mirrored his destiny. Through a constant stream of correspondence and trusted envoys, she reinforced the grim lessons of his father's ascension, reminding him that sentimentality was a fatal flaw and that the path to the throne was paved with the ghosts of one's own kin. Her ambition was not purely selfless. She knew that her son's success was the key to her own ultimate triumph, the moment she would be elevated from a favored consort to the supreme position of Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. She cultivated his resolve, steeled his nerves, and ensured that when the inevitable moment came, he would be ready to perform the terrible, necessary duty without hesitation, transforming him into the perfect instrument of a system she intended to master. The long and anxious wait, a period of simmering ambition and maternal guidance, finally came to an end in the biting cold of January, in the year 1595. On the 16th day of that month, Sultan Murad III, the father of Mehmed, breathed his last. But his death was not announced with the solemn call of the muezzin or the draping of black silks over the palace walls. Instead, it was met with a frantic and suffocating secrecy, a conspiracy of silence orchestrated by the highest echelons of the court, with Safiye Sultan at its center. For 11 agonizing days, the mighty Ottoman Empire was technically without a ruler, a ship floating rudderless on a treacherous sea, while its captain lay dead in his chambers. An elaborate and morbid charade was put into motion to conceal the truth from the world, and most importantly, from the palace itself. The Sultan's body was preserved with ice and perfumes to fight the inevitable advance of decay, while physicians continued to enter his chambers carrying trays of useless medicines, their faces grim masks of deception. Life in the palace was ordered to continue as normal, but the atmosphere grew thick with a poison of unspoken truth, a palpable tension that coiled in the silent halls and gilded chambers. Every whispered conversation fell silent when guards approached. Every sideways glance was laden with fear and suspicion. Within the labyrinthine confines of the imperial harem, this terror reached its zenith. The mothers of Murad's 19 other sons, the half-brothers of Mehmed, knew precisely what this silence meant. Their sons' lives were now measured not in years, but in the number of days it would take a messenger on the fastest horse to reach Manisa and for Mehmed to travel back to the capital. Each rising sun was a tick of a clock counting down to a certain doom, a relentless and horrifying build-up to a preordained tragedy. This meticulously maintained deception was a political necessity, a desperate gambit to prevent a premature power grab from another prince or a janissary rebellion in the ensuing vacuum, ensuring the throne remained cold and empty for its intended occupant. It was a period of suspended animation, 11 days of dreadful anticipation where an entire empire held its breath, waiting for the arrival of its new master and the terrible, bloody work that would inaugurate his reign. When the secret message finally arrived in Manisa, carried by a rider half dead from exhaustion, it shattered the provincial calm and set in motion the final, grim act of the succession. Prince Mehmed, now effectively the Sultan, did not waste a moment. There were no grand pronouncements or leisurely preparations for his departure. Instead, he embarked on an immediate and frantic journey eastward, a desperate race against time, conspiracy, and the natural decay of his father's corpse, which his allies were struggling to conceal back in the capital. This was not a triumphant procession, but a desperate high-stakes dash across the frozen Anatolian plateau, a relentless ride through the dead of winter. The rhythmic pounding of hooves on the hard earth was a percussive countdown to the moment he would claim his birthright and perform the terrible duty that came with it. With every mile that passed, the life he had known as a provincial governor receded further into the past, replaced by the crushing weight of the imperial destiny that now awaited him in Constantinople. We can imagine his thoughts during that arduous journey, a whirlwind of ambition, fear, and grim resolve. He was riding towards the pinnacle of worldly power, a position of almost divine authority, yet his path was shrouded in the darkest of shadows. His mind would have been consumed not by the splendors of the throne, but by the chillingly practical matter of securing it, a task that required him to become a kinslayer on a scale unprecedented in his family's history. The faces of his 19 younger brothers, some of whom he barely knew, would have haunted his waking thoughts and sleeping hours, each one a specter he was duty-bound to create. The wind that whipped past his face would have felt like the cold breath of the law itself, the unyielding decree of his great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, pushing him onward towards an act that would define him forever. This relentless journey was more than just a physical passage from one city to another. It was a profound spiritual and psychological transformation, a dark pilgrimage from which there was no return, where each league covered brought him closer to absolute power and absolute damnation. Upon his arrival in Constantinople, a city shrouded in a palpable, nervous quiet, Mehmed III was swept immediately into the heart of the Topkapi Palace, the epicenter of the power he was born to inherit and the stage for the horror he was bound to unleash. There was no time for rest, no moment for quiet contemplation after his arduous journey. The gears of the state, so carefully held in stasis, began to grind into motion with his presence. He was quickly robed in the opulent silks and furs of a sovereign, the immense physical weight of the garments, symbolic of the crushing burden of responsibility he was about to formally accept. The enthronement ceremony that followed was a grim and muted affair, stripped of all joy and celebration, performed with a solemnity that bordered on the funereal. In the grand throne room, before the silent, watchful eyes of the highest officials of the empire, the viziers, the pashas, the chief eunuch, and the aga of the janissariate, took his seat upon the imperial throne for the first time. At his side, a formidable and triumphant presence, stood his mother, Safiye Sultan, her ambition finally and fully realized. Her expression a mask of regal composure that betrayed nothing of the bloody machinations that had brought her to this pinnacle of power. She was his anchor and his guide, her unwavering gaze a constant reminder of the task at hand. It was in this moment, with the eyes of the entire Ottoman power structure upon him, that Mehmed performed his first act as Sultan. There was no passionate speech or declaration, only a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture, a nod given to the waiting chief executioner, the Bostanji Bashi. It was a simple, chillingly understated command, a silent order that sealed the fate of 19 souls. In that single, irrevocable moment, he crossed the threshold from prince to sovereign, from brother to executioner, fulfilling the dark prophecy of his lineage and affirming the terrible, cold logic of the law that governed his world. The order was given. The die was cast. And in the shadowed halls of the imperial harem, destiny, in the form of the silken cord, began its inexorable march toward his brothers. With the order given, a silent and terrible efficiency descended upon the palace. The chosen instruments of this grim policy, a specialized corps of royal executioners, often deaf-mutes who could hear no pleas and tell no tales, began their methodical work. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the imperial harem, a place designed for life and pleasure, now repurposed into a sterile and silent abattoir. Their weapon was not the brutal arc of a headsman's axe, but something far more intimate and chilling, the silk bowstring, a simple cord whose purpose was to extinguish royal life without spilling a single drop of sacred royal blood, a morbidly respectful tool for a sacrilegious act. The narrative of the night becomes a relentless, rhythmic progression of death. Imagine the scene as the executioners entered the first chamber. A young prince, perhaps a man grown, old enough to understand the Game of Thrones he had just lost, was roused from his sleep. His final moments, a terrifying blur of silent, imposing figures and the sudden, unyielding pressure of silk against his throat. Then, they moved to the next room, and the next, and the next. The horror was compounded by its scale and its cold, bureaucratic precision. They moved through the chambers of the younger princes, boys who were startled from their dreams not by assassins but by what must have seemed like strange, silent servants. And then, most terribly, they came to the nurseries, where infants lay sleeping in their ornate cribs, their lives so brief they had never even had a chance to comprehend their own lofty station, let alone the danger that came with it. Their mothers, powerless and imprisoned in their own chambers, could only listen to the terrifying silence, a silence punctuated by the soft creak of a distant door, a muffled scuffle, and then nothing, a void of sound that signified an extinguished life. This was a harvest of sons, a systematic culling of the dynastic tree, each death a quiet, brutal, and final punctuation mark in the first sentence of the new sultan's reign, a horrific crescendo of violence that left 19 bodies waiting for the dawn. As the first pale light of dawn on January the 28th crested the hills of Constantinople, it did not bring with it a sense of renewal, but rather revealed the horrific toll of the night's work, casting long, somber shadows over a city about to be united in grief. The great gates of the Topkapi Palace, which had been sealed to contain the secret of the old sultan's death, now swung open to facilitate a grim and public spectacle. What emerged was not a triumphant new ruler on horseback, but a slow, agonizing procession that would be seared into the city's collective memory. One by one, 19 simple, unadorned coffins were carried out into the morning chill, borne on the shoulders of palace servants. The sight was a profound and visceral shock to the assembled crowds, a silent, stark confirmation of the rumors that must have bled through the palace walls overnight. The sheer number was staggering, but the varying sizes of the caskets delivered the most heartbreaking blow. Some were the length of a grown man, while others were terrifyingly small, built for children, for toddlers, for infants who had never even learned to walk. This funereal parade was the ultimate public accounting of the price of power. Ottoman chroniclers of the era reportedly described how a great wail rose up from the city, a wave of sound that followed the procession as it wound its way through the streets toward the Hagia Sophia, where the princes were to be buried beside the father they shared with their executioner. This was not an act of rebellion, for the populace understood the unforgiving logic of the state, but it was a spontaneous and deeply human outpouring of sorrow, a lament for the innocent lives sacrificed at the altar of imperial stability. The air, thick with the scent of winter and wood smoke, became heavy with the sound of weeping. In this moment, the abstract principle of Nizam, alam was stripped of its political justification and revealed for what it was, a source of profound, recurring trauma for the dynasty and the people it ruled, a system that bought order at the cost of its own soul, leaving a trail of tiny coffins as proof of its terrible, bloody bargain. Having paid the terrible price required by the system, Mehmed III was now the undisputed and absolute master of the Ottoman Empire, his throne secured upon a foundation of 19 silent graves. From the cold perspective of statecraft, the brutal purge had been a resounding success. There would be no civil war, no opportunistic rebellions led by rival brothers, no fracturing of the realm. The machinery of the state could now function without the threat of internal schism, allowing the new sultan to turn his attention to the pressing matters of governance and war. And for a time, he proved to be a capable, if not remarkable, ruler. In a significant break from his immediate predecessors, he personally led his army into the field during the long and grueling war against the Habsburgs in Hungary, fulfilling the ancient role of the Ghazi warrior sultan. At the pivotal Battle of Carrestas in 1596, he overcame a near-catastrophic defeat to snatch a decisive and bloody victory, a triumph that shored up the empire's northern frontier for years to come. Yet, the specter of the act that inaugurated his reign was never far from his mind. The paranoia that is the natural disease of all absolute rulers seemed to infect him with a particular virulence, a constant, gnawing fear that the ambition he had seen in his brothers might one day take root in his own sons. This deep-seated anxiety was relentlessly stoked by the whisperings of court factions and the ever-present influence of his mother, Safiye Sultan, who saw any potential rival to her own power, even her own grandson, as a threat to be neutralized. This corrosive fear eventually found a target in his eldest son, the promising and popular Shahzad Mahmud. On the basis of mere suspicion and coerced confessions of a supposed plot, Mehmed made a decision that revealed the true, tragic irony of his life. The man who had annihilated his own generation of siblings to secure his power now turned that same deadly logic upon the next, ordering the execution of his own heir. The system that had forced him to become a fratricide now compelled him to commit filicide, ensuring the bloody cycle of dynastic survival would continue to consume its own future. The execution of 19 princes in a single night, followed by the public spectacle of their funeral, was more than just another grim chapter in the history of the Ottoman succession. It was a profound and traumatic turning point, a moment where a long-standing policy was pushed to its absolute, horrifying extreme and, in the process, revealed its own unsustainability. While the law of fratricide had been a known and accepted, if dreaded, part of the political landscape for over a century, the sheer scale of Mehmed III's purge was different. The killing of 5 brothers by his father had been a tragedy. The killing of 19, many of them infants, was a moral and political catastrophe that shook the very foundations of the dynasty's legitimacy. The act, while technically legal according to the conqueror's decree, generated a deep and unspoken crisis within the Ottoman elite. The ulema, the clerical body of Islamic scholars who gave religious sanction to the Sultan's rule, could not have been anything but deeply disturbed by such a massacre of innocents. The janissaries, the elite slave soldiers sworn to protect the person of the Sultan and the integrity of his house, had been made complicit in the near-total annihilation of the dynasty they were supposed to defend. There was a palpable sense that a line had been crossed, that a tool designed to ensure order had become a weapon of grotesque self-mutilation. The system had reached its logical, yet monstrous conclusion. What had once been a brutal but seemingly manageable political solution now looked like a pathway to dynastic suicide. The unspoken question must have hung heavy in the minds of the court's senior statesmen. If this sultan had 19 brothers to kill, what if the next had 30 or 40? The law, designed to prune the family tree, now threatened to uproot it entirely. The brutal efficiency of the act had exposed its inherent flaw, creating a visceral revulsion that the cold logic of Nizam-ul-Alam could no longer assuage. The public grief was a symptom of this deeper crisis, a sign that the human cost of the policy had finally become too great to bear, forcing the dynasty to confront the horrifying possibility that its method for survival was, in fact, a self-fulfilling prophecy of its own destruction. This profound institutional crisis, a silent sickness born from a surfeit of blood, finally found its breaking point upon the death of Mehmed III in the year 1603. When his teenage son, Ahmed I, ascended to the throne, the entire Ottoman court held its breath, expecting the grim and bloody repetition of the ritual that had become so horribly familiar. By all legal precedent and tradition, Ahmed's first duty was to order the execution of his only brother, a young prince named Mustafa, thus securing his own reign in the same manner as his father and grandfather before him. But then, in a decision that would fundamentally alter the destiny of his dynasty, Ahmed refused. He would not sign his brother's death warrant. Having grown up in a palace haunted by the ghosts of his 19 murdered uncles and the paranoia that consumed his own father, the young sultan made a revolutionary choice to break the bloody cycle. Instead of the executioner's silk cord, a new solution was devised, a system that was seen as both merciful and politically pragmatic. Prince Mustafa was not killed, he was confined. He was placed in a lavishly appointed suite of rooms deep within the Topkapi Palace, an opulent prison that would become known to history as the Kafes, or the cage. This was a compromise born of trauma, a novel attempt to solve the perennial problem of succession without resorting to mass fratricide. The Kafes was designed to be a gilded cage, a place of luxurious isolation where royal princes could live out their lives in total seclusion, cut off from the world, from military training, from governance, and from any faction that might seek to place them on the throne. It was a form of living death, a policy that preserved the spare heir while ensuring his political impotence. The law of fratricide was not formally abolished, but it was now held in abeyance, replaced by a system of permanent house arrest that effectively ended the state-sanctioned murder of princes, a direct and lasting legacy of the night of horror that had inaugurated his father's reign. The profound moral crisis precipitated by this act of mass fratricide bled into the next generation, creating an imperative for change that fell upon the shoulders of Mehmed's young son and successor, Ahmed I. When he ascended the throne in 1603, the court and the empire fully expected a grim repetition of the established ritual. The law was the law, and Ahmed's own brother, Mustafa, stood as a living, and therefore unacceptable, threat to the stability of his reign. The executioners were ready, the silk cord was prepared. But then the unthinkable happened. The new sultan, a youth who had grown up in the long, dark shadow of his father's monstrous deed, refused to give the order. He broke the bloody chain of tradition. This revolutionary decision, born from the trauma of the recent past, necessitated a new solution to the ancient problem of succession. If the spare heir was not to be killed, he had to be controlled. Thus was born the infamous system of the Kafes, or the cage. Prince Mustafa was not led to the executioner, but to a suite of opulent, secluded rooms within the vast complex of the Topkapi Palace. This was to be his world, a gilded prison where he would live in splendid isolation, denied any role in governance, any military training, or any contact with the outside world that might allow him to foment rebellion. The Kafes was a radical compromise, a way to preserve the body of a rival prince while politically neutralizing him, effectively ending the practice of sanctioned fratricide not by abolishing the law, but by creating a permanent, living alternative to it. The specter of 19 coffins had so horrified the dynasty that it chose to trade the swift finality of murder for the slow, quiet cruelty of lifelong imprisonment. The perceived mercy of the cage, however, soon revealed itself to be a different form of poison, one that worked not with the swiftness of silk, but with the slow, creeping rot of psychological decay. In solving the problem of fratricide, the Ottoman dynasty had inadvertently created a new and equally insidious crisis. For the next 3 centuries, the princes of the imperial house were spared the executioner only to be condemned to a living death. They grew up in gilded isolation, their world confined to a few ornate rooms, their minds starved of education in governance, warfare, or the simple realities of the empire they were meant to one day lead. This profound seclusion, often lasting for decades, combined with the ever-present fear that a succeeding sultan might revert to the old ways and order their death, became a potent recipe for madness. When a sultan died, his heir would be retrieved from the kafes, blinking in the sunlight like a man unearthed from a tomb, and placed upon the throne. These men were often tragically and dangerously unprepared. They were either paralyzed by indecision, crippled by paranoia, or fully disconnected from reality. The empire, which had once been led by hardened, pragmatic rulers who had survived a brutal system of natural selection, was now increasingly governed by the damaged and the incompetent. The system had traded the sharp, public horror of fratricide for the quiet, hidden horror of mental disintegration, sacrificing the competence of its rulers for the preservation of their bodies. This became the final, dark irony of Mehmed III's legacy. His shocking brutality ended a cycle of murder, but the solution it inspired ultimately weakened the very throne he had killed to protect, leaving the great empire to face the modern world not with a ruthless warrior at its helm, but often with a broken man who had spent a lifetime staring at the walls of a beautiful cage. In the final accounting, the story of the Ottoman succession is a profound and cautionary tale about the flawed human pursuit of a perfect, unassailable system of power. The dynasty found itself caught between 2 terrible poles, 2 competing forms of destruction. On one side lay the swift, red-hot chaos of civil war, a recurring fire that threatened to consume the empire entirely. On the other lay the cold, sterile, and brutally ordered world of sanctioned fratricide, a solution that demanded a dynasty sacrifice its own blood to preserve its name. For a time, the latter was deemed the lesser evil. But Mehmed III's act of supreme violence revealed that this solution was a poison that grew more potent with every application, until it threatened a complete moral collapse. The turn toward the kafes was, therefore, not a true solution but merely a swapping of poisons. The dynasty traded the sharp, public agony of the silk cord for the slow, quiet affliction of the gilded cage, a cure that rotted the leadership from within. In their attempt to engineer a system free from the violent risk of succession, they created a sterile environment that produced rulers too fragile to face the chaotic realities of the world. The terrible irony is that the Ottoman state's greatest fear, the chaos that could tear it apart, was ultimately less fatal than the suffocating order it created to prevent it. The quest to eliminate one existential threat had merely given rise to another, proving that power, when too perfectly insulated from risk and reality, does not preserve itself. It simply hollows itself out until it becomes a fragile, empty shell, waiting for the inevitable winds of history to blow it away.